Hi, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Charles Kupchan, who's today's speaker, who is a frequent traveler to Europe. I mean, you are the one of the transatlantic links, even of the U.S. government, at least in the past. So Charles Kupchan is a professor in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, and a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. And he used to work for government, both in the Obama and Clinton administrations as security advisor and member of the National Security Council. So one of the persons who has been very close to power, observing power, trying to observe the world order, how it is developing, and that will be also about the talk today. So I'm very happy to have you here. Very happy to have the opportunity for us to engage some of the ideas and some of the challenges which lie before us. And in this, I will be very nicely helped by Professor Rebecca Adler-Nissen, who is here at the University of Copenhagen, who is a good friend of DIIS and has been already here several times before, being also in the board, and has helped us, to make this a place which is nice to work in and to have people around. So I'm very happy to have you all here. She is a specialist on many things, has worked on stigmatization, the European Union, digital diplomacy, has a series of research projects which are going on. And I think it is a nice mixture of ways of dealing with what seems to go ahead and be in front of us, and not always very nice looking. Let me put it this way. So we have no further ago. So the setup is a relatively easy one. Charles is going to give us a talk. We will engage a little bit the talk, and then you will engage whoever is at the floor. Thanks very much for coming again. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for the warm welcome. Thanks to all of you for coming out in this raging snowstorm. I know it's going to shut the city down soon, so and thanks also to Rebecca for coming and joining the conversation. Stefano and I have been trying to make this happen for about 4 years. The pandemic got in the way, and I think there were some other logistical nightmares. So it's a special pleasure to actually be standing here and see the fruition of what must be several hundred emails by now. I'm going to do something that is probably unwise as a speaker in two respects. One is I'm going to really range very broadly and try to engage all of you and Rebecca and Stefano in a big discussion about global order and where the world might be headed, where the world should be headed, because I think that it's a conversation we need to have. It's not really taking place. I think in some ways it was taking place, at least in some circles in my own country. I think the U.S. government was beginning to kind of feel its way forward, and the war in Ukraine kind of shut that down. And in some ways, it's sent history into reverse, and now the various groupings are doubling down on geopolitical rivalry, and we're headed back toward a Cold War. And what should have been a moment of kind of fresh thinking about where global politics is headed is now sort of frozen and on hold. And the second reason this is somewhat perilous is this is part of a project that I'm just beginning. And so please see this as a brainstorming session. I'm thinking through where this project will go, and in that respect, you're not going to hear the results of something that has been completed or is anywhere near completion. You're going to hear the reflections of really mapping out a project that has yet to be done. So with those two caveats, let me let me jump in. I think that the global system is at an inflection point in several different dimensions. And by inflection point, I mean a historical tipping point where we have been living in a world in which there has been a progressive tilt to history, really since the 1700s. And the footprint of liberal democracy has been growing, not necessarily in a linear, steady fashion, but it's been, the arc of history has been bending in a clear direction. Now it's bending in the other direction. The world is becoming less free. Autocracies are becoming more autocratic. Liberal democracies, including my own, are going through levels of uncertainty and instability of a sort that I certainly never imagined. Yes, Biden beat Trump. Yes, the U.S. midterms didn't do well to the whack jobs who had supported Trump, and the American electorate seems to be tiring of craziness. But this story is by no means over, and I would say the same thing about liberal democracy on this side of the Atlantic, although, as I'll come to in a minute, I think if there is a healthy spot in the liberal democratic map, it's here. I think Europe is in many respects in better shape politically than the United States or the UK, for that matter. But in any case, this kind of sense that history is heading in a clear direction, I don't think we can take that for granted anymore. As I said, the direction of that arc has bent back. And by my latest calculation, only 7% of the world's population today lives in countries that are coded as full, free, democratic states. That's not a lot. The second reason that I think that we're at a tipping point is that great power competition is back ahead of schedule. We knew that we were headed into a world in which there would be more contestation over hierarchy and status, simply because we knew that the global system was being deconcentrated and that power was shifting from west to east. And we are witnessing a tectonic shift of a sort that's on the same scale of the tectonic shift that occurred 300 years ago when the globe's center of gravity shifted from east to west. In the year 1700, half of global wealth, of global GDP, was comprised by India and China. You then hit the industrial era, the commercial revolution, and the pendulum swings to the north and to the west. And Europe and North America have ever since, let's pick the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, been at the vanguard of history. Now the pendulum is swinging back. If you look at global economic projections from Goldman Sachs or Price Waterhouse or any of the big banks, they forecast that by 2050, the top 4 economies in the world will be China, India, the United States, and Indonesia. That's a big change. If you look at where global growth will come from in this century, it's generally coming from East Asia. And that's because that's where there are large populations. The Indian population, as far as we know, and we don't have good numbers, has just surpassed the Chinese population. And India is catapulting through over, in many respects, the industrial era to the digital era, which is giving them the ability to grow quite quickly economically. The third the third dimension that I think is part of this supposition or proposition that we are at an inflection point is, and this is related to my first point, the stumbling of liberal democracy. It would have been one thing had we seen that arc of history bend back because countries that were in the transition to democracy stalled or reversed, or if we saw autocratic states becoming more autocratic, which we do. Both of those things are true. But what I think is particularly puzzling and concerning is the rise of illiberal democracy in established liberal democracies. It's certainly not something that I saw coming. And as I said, if you, if the core democratic system itself begins to come apart, I think that will change global politics in very significant ways. And we know that this is not just accidental or idiosyncratic because it's too widespread. If it were just Trump, or if it were just Orban, or if it were just Erdogan, then we could say, shit happens, right? No big deal. But it's not, right? It's India, Israel, Brazil, right? This is a systemic phenomenon that is compromising what we took to be the stability, the future of countries that we thought were on the other side of history. Finally, I think we have a host of new kinds of challenges out there that we have never confronted before as an international community, and that demand increased levels of global cooperation and collaboration. Climate, global health, nuclear proliferation, management of the cybersphere, management of new technologies like AI, quantum, right? These are uncharted waters. But we're headed into a world in which the return of geopolitical competition, the rise of illiberal populism, are making it very, very difficult to provide the level of transnational dialogue and cooperation needed to tackle these challenges. And so I think we're headed into an era in which the gap between the demand for global governance and the supply of global governance will be as large as it's ever been. Second set of remarks. If we took a snapshot of the global landscape today, I think at first blush one would conclude that we're headed back to something resembling Cold War bipolarity. Because on the one hand, you have the liberal democracies centered around the U.S. alliance network, and this system is enjoying a new lease on life, a rebound of a sort that we didn't imagine until Russia invaded Ukraine. And on the other side of the new divide, we have not just Russia, but Russia and China. And we're hearing that the Russians may soon enjoy the arrival of Chinese weapons. We don't know, but this is a relationship that seems to be getting tighter and tighter. And as a consequence, we could say, well, we're going back to a world that looks a lot like the world before 1989, with the Western democracies on one side, the autocracies on the other side, and militarized rivalry between the two blocs. For several reasons, however, I don't think that the Cold War playbook is going to give us a great deal of purchase on the world that seems to be opening. Several considerations. One, during most of the Cold War, China and Russia were at odds. They came together in the early 1950s. They forged a very close partnership, but it unraveled by the end of that decade. And for the rest of the Cold War, Beijing and Moscow spent more time going after each other than they did working together. That's not the situation today. We're now looking at a Sino-Russian bloc that stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to the Western Pacific. Secondly, I think we have in China a country that will be a peer competitor of the United States in a way that the Russians never were. China has 1.4 billion people, the United States around 330 million. Yes, the Chinese population is beginning to shrink, but it's expected to shrink by around 8% by 2050. So even if you discount the productivity of Chinese workers, we're still looking at an economy that will outpace the American economy very significantly. And most people believe that in terms of aggregate GDP, China will surpass the United States by the end of this decade. It's already done so in terms of purchasing power parity. Furthermore, China, unlike Russia, has been able to move from the industrial era to the digital era in a fairly impressive way. China is becoming a high-tech hub. It may not rival Silicon Valley yet, but in AI, in drones, in digital payment, in quantum computing, at least the scientists that I talk to are saying that China is at or near the top of the global game. That's new. Third factor, I'm struck by the degree to which the war in Ukraine has smoked out a global South that wants nothing to do with taking sides. Most of the world has reacted to Russia's invasion of Ukraine by saying, don't look at us. No sanctions, an unwillingness to verbally condemn what is an unabashed act of aggression. And it looks as if this world that we're headed into, as a consequence, will be much more multipolar in character and practice than bipolar, because significant countries aren't going to take sides. Look at India. India is, for me, a bellwether. And India is increasing its relationship with Russia, not stepping back. India is, on the one hand, participating in the Quad, which is a new grouping, or a revived grouping of the US, India, Australia, and Japan to stand up to China. It sees itself as part of the democratic grouping, but it is also joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And it is not willing to stick itself into the middle of a growing rivalry between East and West. And I don't blame them. But I think it is an important sign of things to come. Final observation I'd make in this respect is that it's important to keep in mind that the Cold War was an era of really stark geopolitical and commercial separation. We were over here, they were over there, and there was very little interaction between the two spheres. Today, we are in some ways, I think, irretrievably interdependent. We are commercially integrated with China in a way that we were never commercially integrated with Russia. And as a consequence, the world in many respects will be, for the first time in history, interdependent, integrated, but multipolar without a captain at the helm. And that's because really since globalization set in the 19th century, it was guided either from London or from Washington, Pax Britannica or Pax Americana. Now we're headed into this world in which there won't be Pax anything. There won't be Pax Americana, there won't be Pax Sinica, but there will be an integrated multipolar world, and we need to figure out how to manage that world. And that, to me, is in many respects the challenge of our time. How to manage an integrated multipolar system when there's no captain at the helm. Third set of remarks. What do I think's going on here at root? Why are we experiencing this level of global transformation, disarray, and why in some respects are we being particularly flat-footed in thinking through what we do? The quick and dirty version of my answer to that question is that we are witnessing the implications, the knock-on effects, the consequences of the tectonic shift from the industrial era to the digital era. And that shift is having socioeconomic and geopolitical consequences that are every bit as profound as the socioeconomic and geopolitical consequences of the shift from agricultural era to the industrial era. This transition from industrial to digital is one of the reasons that the global economy is shifting as quickly as it is. Yes, China rose on the back of the industrial era, but it's quickly jumping into the digital era. As I mentioned, China seems to be India to be jumping over much of the industrial era. The fastest growing digital commercial region in the world is Southeast Asia. And so it's in many respects this transition to the digital economy, which requires much less infrastructure, fewer pipes, more training. It's one of the reasons that you are able to see countries relatively quickly move up the pecking order. It is also, in my mind, the main source of the illiberal populism and the electoral democratic discontent that we see in many advanced industrialized democracies. There are a lot of studies out there about populism, about Trump, about AfD, about Brexit, and so there are many different data sets and contending theories, but at least in my own mind, I see the root of the problem being the economic dislocations caused by automation and the onset of the digital era, coupled with free trade, coupled with immigration, but driven principally by this broad socioeconomic insecurity that has been caused by the transition from the industrial to the digital economy. And I'll come back to that in a second. And much of that discontent then gets amplified by social media. It gets amplified by these new digital technologies that are transforming not just the way we communicate, but also our identities and exacerbating communal divisions, partisan divisions, ethnic divisions, racial divisions, in many respects because of the ability of self-interested parties to capitalize on these new, largely unregulated, oftentimes not sufficiently understood digital technologies. Let me drill down on a few of the factors that I've already mentioned, and then begin to offer a few thoughts on where we go from here. As I've mentioned, I think it's pretty clear that we're headed into an era of global multipolarity, and I won't say much more about that. Two, that the digital age is a transformative historical moment, and that we are at the very beginning of it. Part of the reason that I don't think we're having a full-throated conversation about what this transition means is that it would be a little bit like sitting in this room, which didn't exist, but in 1700, and saying, well, what's the industrial era going to look like? We don't know. We don't know what the digital era is going to look like, but we know it because we can see the tip of the iceberg that it's going to be transformative. What are average workers going to do 15 years from now to earn a living wage? I don't think we can answer that question. In my own country, a lot of the workers that used to be at GM or Ford are now at Walmart and Amazon and at McDonald's, or they're Uber drivers, or they're truck drivers. It may be that those jobs have been automated in 15 years. What are the consequences of that? What are those workers going to do? Two final reflections before I turn to where do we go from here. One is to say a few things about the U.S., especially for an audience that is mostly, I assume, or all entirely non-American. I do think that the United States is in some ways a driver of not necessarily a driver of or a cause of the disarray, but understanding where we are today does require some reflection on the trajectory of the United States since the end of the Cold War. Because I think part of the story that I'm telling today and that we need to unpack is about the liberal overreach that began in the 1990s. And I think that the rather triumphalist reaction to the fall of the Berlin Wall does help us understand how we got where we are today in several different respects. One was the triumph of neoliberal orthodoxy in the 1990s, which really occurred after the 94 election. The Democrats under Clinton tacked to the center. Wall Street moves into the Democratic Party, and you really do see the very substantial dismantling of the more traditional Democratic agenda. Deregulation. Focus on increasing shareholder value. Bringing down the cost and size of the social protection system. Yes, we were already beginning to see the decline in the size and the prosperity of the American middle class, but it was really expedited by the policy changes that were implemented in the early post-Cold War era. And let me just give you a few data points to drive home the scope of the change. In the 1960s, the largest employer in the United States was General Motors. The average wage of a General Motors worker was $30 an hour in today's dollars. Today, the largest employer in the United States is Walmart. The last time I checked, the average wage of a Walmart worker was somewhere around $11 to $12 an hour. So in other words, almost a 2/3 decline in the income of the average American worker in the largest American company. In 1965, a typical American CEO earned 20 times the salary of that company's average employee. Today, a typical American CEO earns 278 times the salary of the average employee. Between 1978 and 2018, CEO compensation increased by more than 900%. During that time, the workers of those companies, their compensation increased by 11.9%. So 11.9 versus 900%. I don't think, looking at those numbers, it's terribly complicated to understand where Trump came from. I come from Wisconsin. When I grew up there, it was as nice and centrist and purple, i.e., ideologically moderate a place as you could find. Right? I spent my childhood fishing and picking berries and farming, and and now Wisconsin is like ground zero for partisan warfare. And I haven't been there in quite a few years, but when I talk to my friends who still live there, they tell me that if I go to Beloit or Oshkosh or Racine or all these towns that I went to as a kid, which used to be thriving towns with factories and small businesses, they're dead. They're gone. Main Street is half closed. The public schools are shutting down because there aren't enough children. And that, to me, is at the heart of the problem. And part of that, is unstoppable. Part of it is automation. Part of it is globalization. But I do think that part of it is also the product of decisions that were made in the 1990s that left workers grievously exposed to the onset of the digital economy and to the various other free trade regimes, immigration that intensified over that time. Let me make one other comment about the strategic, what I would call liberal overreach of the 1990s. I think that another reason that we are in deep doo-doo today is that we spent too much time trying to expand the liberal order and not enough time consolidating it. NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, Russia into the G7, China into the WTO. Then 9/11 comes along, and we spend 20 years trying to turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio, believing that the Middle East is going to be transformed and finally liberal democracy will arrive. And it didn't work, and it was very expensive. And I do think that yet another reason that the Trumps of this world are doing well is that this overreach led to a primal scream in the American electorate, coming partly out of economic insecurity, which was too much world, not enough America. What about us? What about the school in Kansas rather than in Kandahar? And we are now beginning to see that reaction return. And I have to say, I give Joe Biden a lot of credit for his handling of the war in Ukraine and the steadiness and leadership he's demonstrated, but I'm worried about it. Especially now that the Republicans are in control of the House and you have a softening of support for Ukraine in the American electorate, and you now have the two leading candidates in the Republican Party, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, both saying it's enough. And I do think that the management of this war going forward is going to be more difficult than it was during year one. But maybe I'll just make that comment and we can pick it up in the conversation. Final kind of observation here about this kind of bending back of the arc of history and why it's happening. We've already talked a little bit about the economic sources of the discontent and the liberal overreach, but I do think that in some ways there are too many factors that seem to be pushing the trend lines in an autocratic rather than a democratic direction. And I just want to tick off a few of them. Again, I think this is something we might want to discuss. The empowerment in places like Turkey, Poland, Israel, of more conservative, more rural, less educated electorates. This is not so much a story of the politics of grievance as it is in the United States, about the entry into political life of a different demographic. Immigration, another issue that is clearly at the forefront in our societies of this turn away from the pluralism, the communal integration that we generally associate with liberal democracy. And I fear that unless we get a handle on immigration, the voices of exclusion are going to prevail. And it's been very interesting to me watching Biden himself struggle with this. Right? He comes into office saying, we're not going to do the Trump thing. We're going to be much more welcoming. And little by little, he has moved more and more to replicate what Trump did. In fact, I saw this morning, right before I came here, a story in the New York Times saying Biden now considering going back to, was it family separation or was that it? Something that's right out of the Trump playbook, right? And that's because you want to win an election in the United States, you need to carry a relatively small number of generally white voters, generally moderates, in a small number of swing states. And they are not happy when there are hundreds of thousands of migrants coming across the southern border. And obviously this is something that resonates in your own societies because you're having your own conversations about this. Final comment here. I do think that we need to understand the implications of a global system in which but a successful rising state is not a democracy. Success matters. Emulation follows success. And the Chinese are pretty good at what they do. 80% of the Chinese public believes their country is headed in the right direction. In the United States, that number is 17%. China is showing up in many different parts of the world with bags of cash and building infrastructure. That matters. Let me conclude with a few very brief thoughts on where I think we should head, or at least what the kind of conversations we should be having are. The first is that I think that it's important to begin to have a conversation about what is strategically feasible and attainable, and not just what is strategically desirable. There is a pragmatism and a realism lacking from our conversation. I was talking to Rebecca and Stefano right before we started about the Munich Security Conference, which took place a few weeks ago. I found it deeply disconcerting because it was, in my mind, completely divorced from reality. It was mainly a kind of Ukraine pep rally. We're going to win. Russia will be defeated. We're going to stay the course. And I hope Ukraine wins. I don't think it's going to happen. But there was no realistic discussion about this kind of world that we live in. And I think, we have to begin to become much more sober and realistic about a world in which there will be multiple poles of power, not one universal Western-led order, but multiple orders. And we're going to have to figure out how to make that world work. We're going to figure out how to compete with Russia and China and whoever else we need to compete with, but also to create modalities to deal with interdependence and globalization, because it's here to stay. The second observation, and this is a piece of it, we need to have a conversation about globalization in the digital era. You guys here in Europe are slightly ahead of the United States, but we in the U.S. do not have a single piece of legislation on anything having to do with the digital world. Nothing on the regulation of social media, nothing on digital commerce, absolutely zero on AI, nothing. And these are changes that are absolutely profound. Furthermore, we seem to be headed into a period in which the main trend lines are deglobalization and decoupling. We need a conversation about how to decouple without deglobalizing. We've started by denying China semiconductors and the ability to build semiconductors. What's next? And can we really afford to go to a world in which there is this deeper commercial and financial separation? Final two observations. I think that the task in the United States, less so here, is rebuilding the political center. And rebuilding the political center is in the first instance about socioeconomic investments. As I said, I'm someone who thinks that at heart the politics of grievance emerge from the socioeconomic insecurity caused by the digital economy and by neoliberal orthodoxy. I think that at least some in the United States understand that. And Joe Biden, in my mind, came into office seeking to directly address it. Build Back Better was a $3 trillion bill aimed at getting broadband into the heartland, getting child care to working families, making community college free, building bridges and roads and tunnels. Because I think he understood that if we don't do this, America's political center will die. And he wasn't able to do it in part because he didn't have the necessary support in Congress. When FDR did these big lifts, he had hundreds of seats, majority in the House and a big majority in the Senate. Biden had a few seats in the House and no majority in the Senate except his vice president. And it's because of those small margins that he had to scale back. He did get some important stuff through, but if there is going to be a rebuilding of the political center in the United States, it's going to take much more work. And I also think that the immigration issue has to be tackled if the conversation about liberal democracy and about pluralism is not going to be hijacked by the hard right. My final comment, I am, even though this is probably not what you would call the most optimistic, uplifting presentation, by nature an optimist. And I think this story will end well. That is to say, the arc of history will again bend in the right direction. But it will not bend in the right direction because we defeat autocracy, because we effect regime change in China and topple Putin. It will be because we get our own houses in order and enable liberal democracy in the digital age to outperform the competitors. So I think we're now in an era in which game is on, in which there are autocratic and democratic and models in between ways forward. And the most important task here is really within. And that doesn't mean ignoring the challenge from Putin, but quite honestly, I am much more fearful of the Trumps of this world than I am of the Putins of this world. We will defeat Putin. I think already in many respects, Russia has suffered a grievous, irreversible strategic defeat in Ukraine. We just don't know how that war ends. But the more serious threat, from my perspective, is that we don't get our lights back on. That we face countries like China that play a pretty good game at a time when we are having difficulty with our own basic political functionality. And so for me, the top 2, 3, 4, 5 priorities really do start at home. Because I think if the liberal democracies of the world get their momentum again and get their lights back on, we will ultimately prevail against autocracies, but not because we defeat them, but because we're better than them and we will outperform them. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for the uplifting talk. In the end.
In the end, yeah.
In the end, there was some Hollywood. So we will have a little bit of a discussion about this liberal and wider order, on which there was also a special issue, an international organization to which you contributed. So there's a nice way to link it up. And so I leave it to Rebecca to start the conversation, please.
Great. Okay. So, wow, that was quite a tour de force. Where to start? Let me just pick 4 points and we can maybe talk about them together and maybe with the audience as well. The first one is about the diagnosis. Where are we? What is this predicament? And I share many of your observations. I think most of us do. We are moving into a multipolar world at the same time as we are incredibly interdependent. Economically, politically, culturally, digitally. The question, of course, is why now? And your argument rotates around the shift in economy, so the global power shift, but also the digital age. And that's true. So there are socio-economic grievances within the West, but I'd like to suggest a somewhat different interpretation of why we're here, and I think it matters because it matters for how then to cope with this. So what if the idea of the liberal expansion since the 17th century is partly a myth in the sense that there were very few true believers. Of course, you had elites in these countries, but for many people, the reason why they would be attracted to ideas of liberal democracies as they emerged was because it was beneficial economically, culturally. It promises equality and status for many people. And the problem is that for many countries outside of the core of the West, in the semi-periphery, this promise remained a promise. So what you see now is a lot of countries, Turkey, Russia too, sees this order as deeply hypocritical. It promises equality between all member states or all states in this international community, but it never fully delivers. The same thing, at least that's my claim, together with Aisha Sarakol in our piece in I.O., is that within the West, in the core of the West, increasingly there are disenfranchised voters that also feel that the status they were promised by liberal democracies, including in the way you explain it, really never came to them. So that's why you find it's not just economic grievances, but it's status grievances. The idea that you were promised a better life, not just in terms of economic status, but also in terms of social recognition. And if you have that merger of discontent from outside of the West, inside the core of the West, then you have this long-term trajectory that explains where we are. And yes, there are two reasons for why now, at least, or maybe more. One is the decline of ideology. So the moment we no longer have communism and liberalist capitalism, we have the potential of mergers between right-wing nationalists and Islamists, authoritarian leaders that have actually very few things in common, but they have one common enemy, and that's the cosmopolitan elite that at least used to represent the highest sort of the pyramid. And when you then have the ingredient you mentioned several times, namely the digital platforms, then that merger becomes even more easy because you amplify those voices and you create a almost artificial demographic, global demographic that share very few things except this idea of there's a common enemy. And there, many talk about the global right, but there's a much broader movement, I think.
Just so I understand, are you saying that in the absence of the big tectonic ideologies, that's why we're going after cosmopolitan elites? Or would this have happened anyway?
It would have happened anyway, I think, but it's amplified by this fact. And just one example, which complicates the story a little bit, is Biden especially has been talking about, this is what we're seeing now is also a division between democracies and authoritarian regimes, which of course to some extent is very true. But on the other hand, if you ask Chinese voters or Chinese citizens, what's the best democracy in the world? They will answer China, 77%. In India, it's 57% who say their democracy is the best. Russia says 36%. It's Russia is the best democracy, but even Turkey as well. So you have a situation where the very idea of democracy apparently has become so broad that most countries say they're the democracy. So this also complicates the notion that this is what we're going to save if people understand themselves to be living in democracies already, even better ones. So yes, the tipping point is there. There is a particular tectonic shift, but I think it partly has to do with the hollowness of the liberal order in the first place, the fact that it wasn't fully delivering, not even before the 90s and the neoliberal project and overreach. So it's a very long historical development. Finally, I'm just going to say one thing about digital technologies and one thing about the war in Ukraine. Digital technologies, seen from Europe, yes, we might have legislation that's sort of trying to rein in a bit of the small parts of the platforms and small parts of the digital economy, but still we're very far from that. The problem here is that we have no digital companies that can even compete at any stage. So the attempts to build a European Google or a European Amazon have all failed. So what we're left with is only regulatory power, or the so-called Brussels effect. And this has been then led to a sort of neo-protectionist move where you have like state aid into building our own chip companies, microchip companies, or build our own quantum computers. And so what you might see here is a real geopolitical battle between the US and Europe, unless we get this right. And part of the answer must, seen from a European perspective, be that the US moves much faster in terms of regulating its own companies, so we know where data goes. That's a long story, but I think here's a real puzzle, here's a real problem in terms of getting this right. Finally, on the war in Ukraine, the pragmatism, the realism that you stand for here, I think in many countries, especially in the eastern part of Europe, is simply not possible. It's simply not possible to live so close to a neighbor that's so frightening, and where the interpretation is that unless Ukraine wins totally, Putin will just go for the next country. And that interpretation is very widespread. You could say that's just as pragmatic as your pragmatism, but it raises the question of what is a pragmatic solution in the end, because accepting a divided Ukraine, which we don't know what's going to happen, is not a pragmatic solution seen from at least most part of the European continent, including from a country, some would say, where the pipelines have just been blown up just outside of Bornholm. So here it's seen as very immediate, as a really scary thing, and as an existential threat to the very liberal democracies that the pragmatism is going to save. So I think here the interpretations of what's at stake are very different, but I do agree that the real big problem is that the global south, and actually the rest of the world, don't see this war as existential. And maybe it isn't, at least it's not for them, but it is for some countries very close to Ukraine who can see this just continuing. Yep.
Charles.
Do you want to?
No. I think it's much better if you have
Okay.
first.
On the first set of comments, I basically agree with you, and one of my closest friends in the world is John Eikenberry, who's a big liberal international order kind of guy, as you know. And one fundamental difference of opinion that I've always had with him is, number one, was there a liberal international order? And in my mind there was, except it was pretty small. It was basically the transatlantic community. And we talked about it as if it was a global order, but it really never was a global order because most of the countries outside that community were objects of the order and not participants and beneficiaries of it. Although, China found ways to take advantage of it. I think the question now for me is that order, and I do think there is a kind of intrinsic logic to it. Is it going to survive? And I hope so, because I do think it's an important anchor to the international system. But I'm also struck by the degree, and you mentioned this, by the degree to which in many parts of the world this language is essentially a smokescreen for self-interest and hegemony. And the kind of narrative that the U.S. and Europeans are putting out about the Ukraine war, it doesn't
resonate. No.
It does not resonate. They throw it right back at you. And so there really is a lot of pent-up frustration with this kind of this talk. And the other point I'll make here is that, and where I might differ with my friend John, this was an order that was very much about self-interest. He kind of sees it as, this is what any human being would want, right? No, this is about American interests and American values and European interests and values, and we're pushing them out into the world. There's nothing wrong with that. That's how the world works. But let's just be honest about it. I don't think we have different views on the kind of backlash against cosmopolitan elites. When you say that many people feel that the liberal order didn't work for them, I agree with that, but I think it's in part because of a combination of status concerns and quality of life. And those two things are very difficult to untangle. And I'm not sure they should be untangled because they're opposite sides of the same coin. And I do, I don't know whether this debate is resonating in Denmark, but in the United States, this debate about wokeness is toxic, and it really is difficult for the Democrats right now to navigate it. And that's because on the one hand there is a progressive wing of the party that is pushing certain issues, social issues, but then when you take those questions outside of the two coasts, they get very little traction, and it really does breed this disaffection with what's considered to be cosmopolitan elitism. Interesting comments about the digital landscape. I mean, I basically agree with you. I assume, even though you didn't mention it, that the U.S. CHIPS Act, which is basically industrial policy, expedites what you're talking about, because it's going to create a sense, well, if they can subsidize their digital technologies and build semiconductors with X% tax breaks, then we better do the same thing. And I do think and I didn't mention this in my talk, but another dimension in which we do seem to be passing through an inflection point is I do think the global economic order is at stake here, right? We are seeing protectionist moves. In the United States today, free trade is a dirty word. You will not find either a Democrat or a Republican running for office who will utter the word free trade. And I do think that as a consequence, we really are entering a period in which some of the policies that we took to be, truths are gone. And I do worry that what is so far paced selective decoupling could become something much deeper. On Ukraine, when you were referring to the attitudes, were you referring to Denmark or were you referring to Estonia, or both?
Both, actually. So if you look at polls right now, even countries that have difficulties with this war, and Europe is extremely divided on the degree of pragmatism. Of course, even Germany. You will talk more about this, I'm sure. How fast, how much, etc. But there is a sense in which, or a growing sense, maybe the war itself has created this, that it's an unstable solution with a frozen conflict, because the ambitions of the regime, whoever will be in charge also after Putin, seem to be very stable, like expansionist, imperial.
Right.
And so if you live, and here geopolitics really matter. If this is your neighbor, who has declared that its ambitions go beyond Ukraine, then of course that war is more than just Estonia.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was the basic.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. And I do think that the United States, despite its geographic distance, I mean, you're much closer to this than we are, has demonstrated remarkable interest and steadiness. And I would not have expected that in March 2023, we would still have a strong bipartisan consensus that has led to the appropriation of $113 billion to support Ukraine. That's a big number, right? The average global assistance budget of the United States is $50 billion. Right, 113 billion is a big number, especially coming out of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the backlash against the forever wars. This is impressive to me. As I said, I'm not convinced it will last forever, and that's one of the reasons that I do think that not now, but later in 2023, an effort should be made to bring the war to an end diplomatically. Because I do think that at the end of this fighting season, we will be looking at something that resembles a military stalemate. And that it is unlikely in my mind that Ukraine will achieve victory if that means full territorial integrity. But I would not write off the eventual reintegration of Donbass and Crimea into Ukraine. I just think it's more likely to come through diplomacy in a post-Putin era than through military conquest by Ukraine. And I also do worry about fighting to the finish, in that I think the risk of a wider war is not insignificant. If Ukraine were to try to retake Crimea by force, I think Putin could do something stupid. And I don't underestimate the global knock-on effects of this war, right? Huge economic costs, food shortages, energy shortages, the polarization of the international system. And so I just think we have to cost it out very carefully. What do we lose if we end this war, or try to end the war, before the full reconstitution of Ukrainian sovereignty? What do we lose by letting this war burn on for the next 3 to 5 years?
All right. I think I will have a follow-up on your final point on working on first putting your own house into order, which is actually a point that George Kennan did during the Cold War. The Reich lectures is this: we will win the ideological competition with the Soviet Union as long as we have a nice functioning democracy. And for this we could also learn from some of the things which are happening elsewhere. So the main thing was containment on the one hand, but then show to what extent one can do better than the others. I don't think that's wrong in any sense, but I'm not entirely sure it is the only strategy there is. I already said there's a containment strategy, which is the condition for the possibility of this. But there's also to what extent this kind of nice democratic development can ever be done without having a very active foreign policy in the first place, because it is dependent on the way we decouple and not deglobalize and so on. So diplomacy will have to play an incredibly important role for making the conditions of possibility for this home strategy to work in the first place. And what I was wondering a little bit, and since you have been sitting in the White House, not in the main office necessarily all the time, but what is the tradition of opening up for a diplomacy with those actors which could be the incredibly important actors of doing a slight decoupling without deglobalization, namely, as you mentioned, India and Indonesia. So the ASEAN countries have prepared the last G20 in an incredibly intelligent manner. It was in Indonesia. They met before the G20 meeting among themselves. They knew that it will blow up on Ukraine. They wanted, though, to have a final communique that works. And so they started the strategy of talking about the Ukraine war by starting on food security. And the diplomatic effect was a roll-on effect, that in order to get food security, you have to have, and so on, which is basically, don't deglobalize. And then we can also make a critique of the way that the war is going on, and that Russia is actually the one which is the one first to stop it, or as the German foreign minister so nicely said at the UN, if Putin stops the war, if Putin stops, it stops the war. If the Ukrainians stop, it stops Ukraine. So there's a difference, and here they made this kind of an argument. Now, whenever I hear about this, I think there must be zillions of Americans and Europeans. I mean, the US is also in ASEAN as an observer, just as China. So why not using much more this kind of leverage of people who, I mean, Indonesia and India have no interest whatsoever that globalization goes down. So they would be very much interested in having a system in which, and they have no interest to become entirely dependent on China in the first place. But our diplomacy seemed completely blind. I mean, the Europeans are only looking at themselves. I mean, that's the usual thing. But what is the diplomatic component in which one would be able to line up with countries that would be in principle interested in an order in which multipolarity would not necessarily become this great power competition in the first place? And I see our diplomacy extremely feeble, or I might not know it, because I just see what the newspapers write about, and they usually don't. So my first question would be, what do you think has been diplomatically done in order to help? And not just in this, I mean, when Bush went to India in this kind of, it was an anti-China move, but it reminded the Kissinger China anti-Soviet Union move, but it's all this kind of great power political game, but that's not actually the only game that should be played. There is something about the normative order that would be there, in which these countries would play a major role, and in which they maybe should play a major role rather than the big powers that are around. So when you said you can't blame the Indians, maybe it's even more. We should almost encourage the Indians to go further. So that was the first question about this potential of a diplomacy which would work forward to have a world order that is less violent than what could otherwise happen. The other one is, of course, the U.S. relations towards China. So there's this risk of a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, and it's a question, maybe just giving an example. When there was this funny balloon going over the U.S., and And the Secretary of State decided not to visit China for this funny balloon. I was sitting there. How on earth can this happen? I mean, there's a chance to talk together, and we have this little white thing that might be taking pictures as if they didn't have any other pictures anyway, and we blow it up for the balloon. So what is happening there? And because, of course, the risk one can see is that the home ground in the US is so much defined by the competition with China that all of a sudden we just produce a self-fulfilling prophecy. Today, Xi Jinping made the same talk that the US is only interested in containing and putting them down and having nothing else to do. Yeah, well, if that goes up, there isn't very much. And it's not just the Asian component now as having an outside ally. It is how can one redefine one's own diplomacy, one's own vision about the other in such a way to avoid the kind of enemy images. And here there is a little bit of a Cold War analogy that I have in mind, which I'm always critical about myself, because it's the thing when you get older, you always think that things repeat itself, and that's usually not happening. But one should be thinking about how can one avoid this kind of mutual enemy image alteration. Usually one says one should meet, but then when one was able to meet, one didn't. And so maybe you have something more to say from the inside, how the relations towards China could be improved. Because if those two actors don't get their get together at some point in time, it will be difficult for the other ones as well. And the last one is about rising protectionism. How bad is that? Of course, if you say that at this point there would be, then it would be almost the other way around, namely that in some sense there's an attempt to deglobalize without decoupling. So if you think about the initial ideas of embedded liberalism after the Second World War, it was a way of, yes, opening up different economies, but at the same time buffering to a very heavy extent to which globalization would have an effect on the economies. So embedded liberalism is the idea, yes, we open up, at the same time we need a social welfare state to buffer everything inside. And what we see now is, of course, that this opening up is to some extent reduced, but that was already there because we didn't open up the financial markets at all for this system to work. So that there is some type of protectionism that needs to be built into the system when you no longer have the financial markets being outside is almost necessary. So the question might again be how one is making a combined system of this kind of protectionism. So the environment of the OECD or the environment of the trade rounds and so on, which have all been stalled, it would be important to see what kind of diplomacy or what kind of diplomatic initiatives one can do on that particular level and with whom. And the final question I have is about arms control agreements. You said nuclear proliferation. At some point you said it's one of the challenges that we'll have. And this is a question which I'm, again, since you have been closer to the decisions at the time, although not in those administrations which made most of the mess up. Why did we stop having all of these treaties? I mean, I remember Bush Jr., that was the ABM treaty. Remember, we stopped one of the most important arms control treaties because officially the US wanted to defend itself against Iran. And the Russians didn't believe it. Who can blame them? And the INF treaty has been called off by Trump. The conventional arms treaty in Europe has not been prolonged. There have been all the treaties that made the security order in Europe have been dismantled. And honestly, not only because of the Russians. Because there was this tendency to unilateralism, which was extremely strong. So it was not just a liberal heyday, it was US unilateralism, which decided in certain administrations, not in all, to go for it. Is there any reflection upon the fact that there is a need to have a security architecture and that one cannot just run it alone and that one needs to build that up within the US administration these days or in a wider consensus? Because, I mean, you are right. If Trump comes back, then it's MAGA. And then we might have the worst of all, because then it's not only that we don't put our home in order, but by the way that the international is seen, will put everything else into disorder. So that's the last point. So it would be Asia, Asian, China, the kind of protectionism and the idea of having a security order that needs, and then needs now, it's not just a European order, needs one to be integrated with China and so on, whether there are any initiatives in the direction to think about this again.
I'll start with the the China question, because I think it to some extent relates to your first question about dealing with India and Indonesia and others. I think the administration, and this is true not just of Biden, but Trump folks as well, were looking at China with a head of steam. And that the war in Ukraine has amped up the, what you might call, the hawks, to make it extremely difficult to have a level-headed conversation about the relationship with China. And, I do think that one should not underestimate what I would call the ideological bent of this particular group of American, the folks leading the charge, Biden, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Samantha Power. I mean, they're believers in the liberal international order. And when Biden says this is a historic moment in a struggle between democracy and autocracy, I mean, he believes it. And the tenor of the debate, it's hard to underestimate, to sort of overstate how debate about China is really getting overheated. And the balloon example is a perfect case study. I mean, the country went nuts. Right? There was a week of hysteria. People were going outside and, looking up at the sky. And then after shooting down this balloon, we send F-22s and shoot down 3 more balloons. There were probably, hobby weather balloons. And there really is a kind of a frenzy about China right now. And I do think that it is fueled in part by the war in Ukraine, which has created this sense of militarized competition. And it's very hard to insert into that conversation a call for, hey, let's take a deep breath and realize that a measure of cooperation and dialogue with China is essential, right? I mean, how can you imagine a kind of peaceful, reasonably livable world if the United States and China are not working together on certain sets of issues? But right now, that's not where we are. Things are headed in the opposite direction. I agree with you that Blinken should not have canceled his trip. At the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, everybody was waiting to see whether Blinken would meet with Wang Yi. We didn't know, and then finally everyone heard, oh yes, they're meeting.
10 minutes.
And they shouted at each other for 10 minutes. And that's, we can do better, but I'm not sure we will. And that, in part, I think, helps us understand why not enough is being done with Indonesia and India and others, because there is a tendency to see them through the lens of geopolitical competition. And Blinken, he's out there. He went to Central Asia. He's beating the pavement, but this is in part about an effort to win hearts and minds in the big global battle with Russia and China, as opposed to dealing with them on some of the issues on food security, on the issues that they care about, understandably care about. And so I do think that is a good concrete proposal for one way to change the conversation. On arms control, I think two things happened. One is nobody paid attention. There was no serious discussion about major arms control issues from the end of the Cold War, really until maybe even until today, because everybody was focused, number one, on peace, and number two, on terrorism. And so just there was, in the sort of Washington foreign policy discussion, it disappeared. Second thing that I would point to, and you alluded to this, is that as a consequence of the hollowing out of the American political center, it is probably impossible and certainly difficult to contemplate any kind of ratified international agreement. You can't get 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. And as a consequence, we do executive agreements, the Iran nuclear deal, the Paris climate agreement, and that because that's the best you can do, but they fall by the wayside. And I think that political reality has made contractual agreements like arms control less appealing. But you're right that if, CFE, INF, now New START, they're all kind of collapsing. And I do think that if and when we can have a constructive conversation with Moscow, and that may not be for quite some time, we need to have a conversation about this. And about, to come to Rebecca's point about, Estonia and where next, about the relationship along this long border, right? We're about to add
Finland.
820 miles. Is that the length of the Finnish-Russian border? That's a long border.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be cheek by jowl. And no matter how the war in Ukraine ends, we will arm Ukraine to the teeth, and the Russians are going to be just on the other side of wherever that border is, whether it's the 91 border or the February 2023 border, 2022 border. And so we're going to have a discussion about flank limits, about military to military conversations, about advance notice of military exercises. That's going to be a dangerous, long border. I don't think I understood your question about protectionism. So would you mind repeating it?
I think we will rather open up
Okay.
because there's half an hour, and so it would be a good idea to. I might come back later if need be. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's start with the lady behind. Please introduce yourself. Yes, we get the phone so that the streamers can hear you.
Thank you. My name is Birgitte Musin Brøndten. I work for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And thank you very much for a very rich expose where I think I have already made so many notes that I bring back a heavy book. But I have a couple of observations also, and I will also touch upon some of the issues that you also brought up, and thank you for your very good remarks. And the first is about economic inequality that you brought up, and I firmly agree that that is indeed one of the big issues and challenges that needs to be addressed if we are to have a more stable and secure world. And actually, it's global that the inequality has risen. You can see the numbers for almost every country, including Denmark also, although we always talk about how equal we are as society. And I think that some of the problems is also that in the political discussion and debate, the leftist parties, particularly in the Nordic countries, have been talking a lot about identity policies, and they have a little bit lost out on taking up the question on inequality. So they are not picking up these the unsatisfied voters, and on the right wing, of course, inequality has not been their major issue. So you have it's kind of an issue that is not been looked upon. And right now we have an inflation, so it's getting even worse. So I think that's also part of the problem. And then secondly, I think you didn't talk so much about the EU and the EU's role. And what we've seen is that the EU has, in this period of turning point, the EU has come together much more strongly and a bit surprisingly to some of us also. And been ready to kind of move ahead. In Denmark, we moved ahead and abolished by referendum some of the reservations we had towards EU policy. But that's just part of it. But when EU is now talking about taking up a role in the world, and especially with the US withdrawing, how much do you think that's a possibility? They're not a part of the 4 top countries that you mentioned economically, but at least they are still somewhat of a power. But the EU has a lot of problems and dilemmas for itself, and one of them is that we believe that the reason why the EU should have a role is because of the values that the EU stand for, and we have problems internally with values, of course, with Hungary and other countries, but also when we go out to other countries, we try to promote some of the values, and that doesn't make us extremely popular. For instance, in the African continent, where the competition with China and Russia is increasing. So we stand in a dilemma. Should we? The reason for our strengths should be our values, but it's also impeding our possibilities of having influence. And then finally, just on China and Russia, I think as a civilian observer, I've noticed an immense change in the way we looked upon China. I remember when at some point everybody should have Chinese in high school, and we had a lot of delegations going to China to study the miracle and everything. And now all of a sudden it's our competitor, and it's almost our enemy. And I think that's a bit frightening actually to watch it. The same thing is happening with Russians. There was an example of a school teacher in Helsingør who couldn't teach Ukrainian pupils. He had lived in Denmark for 30 years and had no stake in the war. And all of a sudden there were Danish politicians going out and saying, no, it's outrageous that he should teach Ukrainian pupils. So yeah, just a few remarks. Thank you.
Next to the
Dwight Robinson. I'm a master's student at the University of Copenhagen. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. And just 2 really quick questions. I agree with you that democracy has to be consolidated at home. But in terms of foreign policy, how useful is that rhetoric of democracy versus autocracy? Does it alienate, these emerging power centers and major power centers? And does it make diplomacy more difficult if, we essentially aren't walking and talking what we're doing? And then the second question is, you said we're entering into a multipolar world order and that we're going to see multiple orders around the world, the US in the West and Russia and China. Can you talk about some of the other orders that you might think might emerge as we enter into a multipolar world? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Andreas Bøje Forsby. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. Thank you for the excellent presentations and also the comments. So I also want to talk about multipolarity rather than multipolar order. And so you had this observation about how we are moving into this multipolar era, and you mentioned specifically Indonesia and India as coming systemic poles, and I think it's fair to say that they are not quite there. And also, at the same time, we have European great powers in relative decline. We have Russia quickly turning itself into a secondary power, as Joe Biden proclaimed on the first day of the Russian invasion into Ukraine. So, if you look at some of the power capabilities that you need to become a systemic pole, economics, technology, military power, I think it's fair to say that at the current trajectory of where we are now, and if we are looking ahead, we would find China and the US to be at the very front, right? Economically, China has a $20 trillion dollar economy, way ahead of number 3 at $4 trillion. Technologically, if you look at RD, as you also talked about, research and development expenditures, they are also way ahead of number 3 on the list, both the US and China. So number 3 is Japan. And if you look at the output side of technology, you would find that the Chinese and US researchers are neck to neck on registering patents internationally, and also among the most quoted researchers in international journals and all that. So they are far ahead of the other countries. Militarily, I would say that, of course, China's military projecting power is not comparable to the US, but still, if you look at the budgets, they are also, again, far ahead of the others. So it would seem to me that we are stuck at, a 2-power game. Let's just call it bipolarity, maybe this decade and even the next one as well. And even though I realize, as Stefano just said, that we shouldn't make too much of historical analogies, you were talking about whether this could turn into a new kind of Cold War period. So my question, sorry for all this long introduction, my question would be, why is this not really a new Cold War period? Because you alluded to something along those lines. Is it because we don't have an ideological rivalry, because China doesn't proclaim to have a universalist ideology of itself and promote it, or is it more because we are so heavily integrated still economically? And given that we have this strategic decoupling process really intensifying, we might move into or towards 2 blocks pretty soon. We could still be selling pork and soybeans to each other, but if in terms of research and technology, we are decoupled, then it could turn into be rivaling blocks and some sort of Cold War order. So yeah, that would be my question. Why don't we have a Cold War order after all?
And then you come back.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, for the insightful talk. My name is Oksana Didik. I'm the PhD fellow from Skovoroda University, Ukraine, and research assistant from Copenhagen University. So I will have 2 questions. One, as a sober Ukrainian, I would like to know, what kind of Russia could be beneficial for the international security? Like maybe some suggestions, Russia without Putin, without collective Putin, without some small Russias with nuclear weapons inside, or something else. And the second question is, what is the place of the Middle East in the new world order? Because when we were 20 years ago, we were talking about some significant plans for it. What about now? What's the kind of place for this region we are expecting to witness? Thank you.
Thank you. Charles, the world is yours.
All right. I agree with your observation about the failure of either left or right to directly address the problem, and it's led to very strange kind of misalignments, in the sense that in the United States, Trump and his fellow travelers have picked up a lot of votes from disaffected American working class families, but he hasn't done anything to address their problems. Nonetheless, they continue, many of them, to vote in that direction because they believe that Trump and his fellow travelers have their back. But it's this weird disconnect in which people are kind of voting on the basis of emotion and affect rather than who's actually delivering and improving the quality of their lives. And I think that the Biden camp is attempting to address it. The question is, are they doing it fast enough, and is it getting into the bloodstream quickly enough? And some of the things that Biden wanted to do, he hasn't been able to do because he just couldn't get Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema and a few other people to agree to it. Another question is, how quickly does it get into the bloodstream? One of the things that I personally found quite powerful politically was the child. We had a child tax credit, and I for the first time in my life would go to my mailbox and I'd get a check in the mail because I have 3 kids at home, and unfortunately that wasn't sustained. But things that actually speak to making it on a day-to-day basis, I think are what we need right now. But we're not really getting enough of that. Although I have to say that I did find the midterms reassuring in that respect, in that and you mentioned this as well, inflation is, it really is hitting home. I don't know what it's like here, but I because I have 6 people living under my roof, I go grocery shopping every 3 days. And you can just see that, in the course of a week, staples get more and more expensive. A dozen eggs 2 years ago at Trader Joe's was $1.79. It's now $5.
$5.
That's a big change. And so these are issues that I think are these are bread and butter issues that need to be addressed. On the EU, I mean, I agree with you that the European resolve, steadiness, togetherness has been impressive, and that the conversation has shifted in ways that are consequential. I mean, to have Germany agree to spend 100 billion euros on defense is a big deal. Yes, it's going slowly. Yes, Schultz is not the most charismatic human being on planet Earth, but things have begun to move there in ways that are consequential. If Europe is going to have more geopolitical heft, Germany needs to step up. Germany has started to step up. Do I think that there will, Europe will emerge as an independent pole of power in the next 10 or 15 years? No. Do I think that Europe will become a more capable pillar in a transatlantic community? Yes. And I think this war has kind of drained the Macron narrative of strategic autonomy and a Europe that becomes more independent from the United States. That may come, but I think it's going to come more because the U.S. pushes you away and leaves than because you ride off into the sunset because suddenly there's a European army of 15 divisions and 10 aircraft carriers. I don't think that the democracy versus autocracy narrative is helpful. I think that the Biden people believe it, but more importantly, it plays well in American politics. It's a nice, easy way of sort of portraying what the stakes are. But I don't think it is a powerful narrative for galvanizing collective action in a more multipolar world. I don't think most of the countries of the global south, whether they are democracies or not, find this a useful platform or narrative. So I would dispense with it if I were them. In terms of multiple orders and multipolarity versus bipolarity, I would agree with you that there are going to be two dominant powers, China and the United States, and that numbers 3, 4, 5 are going to be significantly less powerful, particularly militarily. And the United States will remain a power of uncontested military primacy for quite a long while. It's going to take the Chinese a very long time, right? The U.S. has hundreds of overseas military bases. China has one. China is still figuring out how to use an aircraft carrier. I've forgotten how many carrier task forces we have, but at least 10, maybe close to a dozen. But I do think that I would put it this way: we will be in a system that is hybrid, bipolar, multipolar. There will be an overlay of U.S.-China rivalry, and then there will be other powers out there who are not fitting into that superstructure. You know, for example, if India has the second largest economy in the world in 25 years, but it's not allied clearly with the U.S. and it's not allied clearly with China, and it really doesn't want to stick its head into that rivalry, that's going to be significant. And that's why, in my own mind, as I kind of peer ahead, this is going to be a messy world, because there will be a kind of bipolar competition up here, and then at that next layer down, lots of players bobbing and weaving. And when to come back to the question of multiple orders or a multicentric world or a polycentric world, I think that there will be a kind of more Sinocentric order. There will be a more Western order. I think you'll see regional and sub-regional orders that matter more. Someone raised the question of the Middle East. I mean, I think there will be more of an autonomous Middle Eastern order, in part because there won't be the same level of engagement by the U.S. The U.S. is stepping back. Are the Chinese going to come in and solve the Israel-Palestine problem? No. They're too smart for that. Right? And so, we are already seeing a kind of Israel-Abraham Accord order emerging in some ways quite independently of external powers. So that's why I think we can talk about a kind of polycentric world that is much kind of messier than the world that we are used to. And the reason that I think there will be a Cold War of sorts, but I don't think that what we should do is go back and just assume it's going to be like the first Cold War. It's going to be very different, in part because China is more capable, in part because of interdependence, in part because of a kind of more multicentric, multipolar order. Final issue, what kind of Russia? I think I'd say a couple things. One, I think we should avoid a narrative, and this kind of comes back to a point that you raised, that if we defeat Putin and drive him out of Ukraine, then everything is fine because he'll never do this again. And if he gets away with Crimea and 400 square miles of Donbass, then tonight he's going to attack Estonia. Right? I mean, that's bullshit. It's like Putin is Putin. He's going to be a tough customer and a spoiler and a expansionist until he's dead, because that's his game. That's all. That's his calling card. And so I think we really do have to wait for a post-Putin era to imagine a different kind of Russia. Now, will that post-Putin Russia be a nicer Russia? Who knows? But in the meantime, I think we just have to hunker down and contain this Russia until we're lucky enough to end up with a different kind of actor. And one issue that I do think is in play right now, and which I would keep a close watch, is, does China start to arm Russia? I think that would be a significant indicator that a Cold War that's more like Cold War 1.0 is in the offing, because I think that would really ramp up the sense of U.S.-China rivalry.
All right, we don't have much time, so I would have a last round, but I would invite everyone to be relatively short, right? So Rebecca said that she would like to ask a question over there. We have one more question. Let's start with these two, and then I see whether three. Three would be probably just enough. Okay, here you go.
The magic three. Yes. So there's just one elephant in the room, which is Taiwan. So I guess here it's almost the inverse relationship. So if many Americans and many Europeans think we need to be pragmatic on the question of Ukraine, I guess it's the Europeans who would say we need to have a more pragmatic Chinese policy. So my question is, what's going to happen in the different scenarios of Taiwan, and how is that going to influence the U.S.-EU relationship? Because here we have a very different ballgame where most Europeans see no alternative to being incredibly dependent on China, and so it's not an option to have a Cold War with China, simply.
Please, you will get the mic. No, it's behind, and so I think. Sorry. Yeah, Marie.
Hi, my name is Marie. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. I was curious to hear more on your final remark about, you talked about the war on Ukraine should end with diplomatic negotiations. And so who are you, would you envision to sit at that negotiating table? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that, because we see a lot of countries in the so-called global south making a bid to sit at that table. And in that regard, I thought it was interesting as well with some of the remarks. Rebecca, you also mentioned that a lot of the countries in the global south don't see this war as essential or existential, but I'm wondering if perhaps it's because what's existential for them is different, what's at stake is different. For example, maintaining this position of so-called neutrality that some of these countries are insisting on, which historically has been important. For example, a country like Brazil, that now is one of the countries also sort of entering this game of wanting to go through the diplomatic route and having talks. Yes, so thank you. I'd be curious to hear more on that.
All right. Last one here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Anina Hagemann. I work for the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Two quick questions. So one, mainly the reasons that you've given so far for us not coming into a strict bipolarity has to do with actors outside the West. I would just like to understand a little bit better whether EU and American interests are actually that aligned, and whether actually the EU, if the US becomes increasingly hysterical, we all hope not, but do we have, as Rebecca was hinting at, perhaps a stronger European interest in disassociating ourselves in some ways from the transatlantic close relations? And the other question is to the question of the global South and whether we understand them well enough. You spoke of smoking them out, and we talk of their fence sitting. We use all these words for their position, which might be sort of a pragmatic foreign policy position, working for their own interests rather than sort of them relating to us. So their problems are, you mentioned food security, but they also are very focused on debt. They're very focused on climate change. We'll have a lot of Indians moving outside of their country just because of climate change in a very short while. Should we be integrating questions of global debt and climate change better in these geopolitical discussions? Because I feel like sometimes we're still stuck in the discourse of the Cold War in the ways we talk of geopolitics, very much with our own glasses on. That was a very long question, but thanks.
On Taiwan and more broadly the U.S.-European approach to China, I'm guessing that there's trouble ahead. And if I were to identify one area where I could imagine Europe and the United States being at odds, it's on China. Because the United States has geopolitical skin in the game that Europeans do not. And the U.S., I think, for the foreseeable future would be committed to go to war with China over Taiwan. And I don't know where Europeans would come down on that, but I'm guessing that we would not find, Danish fighter squadrons participating in that war, or Germans, and so I can imagine there being a divide there. I think that the economic issues are sometimes overstated in that the U.S. is also deeply tied into the Chinese economy. It's not just the German car industry, and so we have a conversation ahead of us about deglobalization and decoupling and the broader economic relationship with China. But I do think that if there is an area where I could see the two sides of the Atlantic going their separate ways, it would be on China. Although I have to say that, as someone who comes to Europe reasonably frequently, the debate here about China has toughened up. It's changed, partly as a consequence of the pandemic, partly as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, and so there has been a convergence of sorts. On the Ukrainian diplomacy, you mentioned pragmatic Americans, Rebecca, and let me just say that I do not represent the mainstream view. I get a lot of hate mail. Okay. I am now a formal member of the League of Genocide Apologists because I have written articles saying that we should try to end this war sooner rather than later, even if it means less than full territorial sovereignty. And so most people that I would say are in the foreign policy community in the United States are Ukraine will win.
Okay.
And so I'm not representative. But, in terms of how I would play this out, I would continue to support Ukraine. In fact, I would expedite the delivery of tanks and other weaponry now. But I would aim to generate a kind of diplomatic game plan to be introduced toward the end of 2023 as the next cold season settles in. And I don't think that if there is to be a diplomatic breakthrough, it's going to come from Erdogan or Modi or someone else. I think it has to be a U.S., Europe, Ukraine, Russia format. And I do think that it's going to be difficult because Ukraine would need to want to participate. And right now it's hard to imagine Zelensky agreeing to sit down and negotiate if some fairly sizable chunk of his country is under Russian occupation. On the other hand, if we get to November and the war has turned into a stalemate and Ukraine is getting pummeled and its economy has already shrunk by 30%, it may shrink by 40% or 50% by the end of this year, it's not inconceivable to me that you might be able to get a ceasefire. Right, and the Russians have incentives too, right? They've lost 200,000 people. This is not fun for the Russians, and so I would, let the Ukrainians get as far as they can this year, and then I would try to introduce an end game. And as I said earlier, I wouldn't write off Donbass and Crimea. I don't think it's in the interests of the West to basically legitimate land grabs by force. But I think that let's not sacrifice Ukraine to save Ukraine. If we can end this war short of full territorial sovereignty and then figure out the future disposition of whatever the Russians still hold, I think we'd be lucky.
All right. So we didn't solve all in this world. Actually, following the discussion, I'm just as nervous as I was before I started, because there are many things which rely on our capacity to reform our own systems, to be able to find a diplomacy which is answering to questions which are of a more general interest to the global south and other countries, and not just the old geopolitical one. All assuming this in an environment in which enemy images and the escalation is going up at the same time. It's a very heroic environment, I guess, in which we seem to be going in the foreseeable future. Maybe it is tough enough so that we come together and have the right initiative, so that your positive and optimistic ending might come true. I would like to thank you, Charles, Rebecca, for the discussion, everyone here in the room, and I hope at some point diplomacy will win, but we don't know exactly when. It's not a nice time when people are dying the same moment that you are having a discussion just about it. So, thank you very much, and I would want now to say have a good day, but. Thank you.